So all of us know that Black voters are a big voting bloc for the Democratic Party, so much to the point that the Democratic Party cannot win without the Black vote. And we've seen this happen just recently in the 2024 presidential election, where Kamala Harris did not win because she didn't get the percentage of the Black vote that Biden received, that Obama received, or even Hillary, and even Hillary lost. But I think we need to look a little bit back into history, and we need to revisit how it became to be so. And we cannot talk about how Black Americans became that powerful voting bloc for the Democratic Party without discussing LBJ. We're going to talk about who LBJ really was and what he did, and how he basically trapped Black voters in the Democratic Party, thus crushing the Black grassroots, and why that is problematic. Let's start with, when did Black voters actually start doing that? So remember, Black voters originally were Republican voters. Why did Black voters flee the Republican Party in the 1960s? Now, let me go ahead and intercept here, because the trolls love to do this and clip things. I am not telling you to join the Republican Party. I'm not a Republican. I'm a registered independent. But I'm showing you a pattern of what happened here. Why? Why did Black voters leave the Republican Party? A lot of this is the Goldwater effect. That is Barry Goldwater. So let's go ahead and get into how he helped make this happen. Vincent Hutchings, a political scientist who studies voting patterns at the University of Michigan, said the first major shift in Black party affiliation away from the Republican Party happened during the Depression. FDR's second administration, led by the New Deal, made the Democrats a beacon for Black Americans deeply affected by the crushing poverty that was plaguing the country. But many Black voters stuck with the party of Lincoln. This part's very important. As much as people tout FDR's New Deal, it is important to remember that that New Deal omitted some people. It is important to remember that FDR's New Deal had exclusionary measures that did not apply to Black Americans and also did not apply to Indigenous Americans. It's important to remember that redlining started under the New Deal. So remember that Black Americans weren't able to move into those suburban neighborhoods and get those homes because they weren't able to get the loans from the bank, and they weren't able to get the loans from the bank because of redlining. So if you lived in a district that was redlined, the banks weren't going to lend to you. So even after the New Deal, the majority of Black Americans did not become voters for the Democratic Party. That happened under LBJ. Let's go back in. The data suggests that even as late as 1960, only about 2/3 of African Americans were identified with the Democratic Party. Now, 2/3 is a pretty big number, but when you compare it to today, that number hovers at about 90%. 90%. So what happened? Barry Goldwater happened. Let's get into this a little bit more. We're going to go down here. This is the part I think a lot of people don't really get into. Goldwater can be seen as the godfather or maybe the midwife of the Tea Party. So this article was written in 2014. So they were talking about the current Tea Party. He wanted the federal government out of state business. He believed the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional, although he said that once it had been enacted into law, it would be obeyed. But states, he said, should implement the law in their own time. Many white Southerners, especially segregationists, felt reassured by Goldwater's words. Black Americans, says Vince Hutchings, felt anything but. African Americans heard the message that was intended to be heard, which was that Goldwater and the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party were opposed not only to the Civil Rights Act, but the Civil Rights Movement in a large part as well. Barry Goldwater gave a gift to LBJ. And what you're going to see is how LBJ was able to use the phrase that you hear a lot, the lesser of two evils. Even back then, He was able to use the lesser of two evils to get Black Americans not only to vote for the Democratic Party, but also to become a reliable, dedicated voting bloc. There's other things that he did that pulled African Americans over to that. We'll get into all of that. But what I want to point out to you is that Goldwater was also openly racist, but LBJ was also racist. What LBJ did was he made an argument for how he would be the lesser evil, and he did so by obviously passing the Civil Rights Act and the social programs. The reason why I'm pointing this out to you today is because the same thing happens now, where you literally had two candidates that were racist that were running, one in the Republican Party, one in the Democratic Party, and one of them did a little bit of something, we call them crumbs, did a little bit of something that would help the Black community to convince Black Americans to not only vote for him, but to continue voting for the Democratic Party for, as he put it, the next 60 years. I'll have them voting for the Democratic Party for 60 years. So Black Americans were still voting for a racist. As we move on, I want to show you this part here. This is important to see. When LBJ ran in 1964, he ran against Barry Goldwater, right? Look at the map. The US presidential election of 1964. You guys see this? This is how LBJ, listen, many of you, we haven't seen a map like this. Like I don't ever remember seeing a map like this as long as I can remember, right? But LBJ won every state except for Arizona, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Now, if you're a millennial like me, I don't remember ever seeing an electoral map like this in my lifetime. But do you see how he was able to get all that? Okay. So if you look at the vote count, you will see here the electoral votes. Lyndon B. Johnson, Barry Goldwater, LBJ received 486 electoral votes, and Barry Goldwater received 52. This is big, mainly partially because he was able to capture the Black vote. And he implemented social programs like Medicare and Medicaid and passage of the Civil Rights Act to make sure that Black voters would stay there. Goldwater was the overt racist, but LBJ was also still a racist. You can see it for yourself. LBJ was a civil rights hero, but also a racist. There's him right there. We'll get into some of the things that LBJ did. Because Democrats, they don't like to talk about this. In Senate cloakrooms and staff meetings, Johnson was practically a connoisseur of the word. Johnson would collaborate his pronunciations by region using the N with some Southern legislators and the other N with others. Discussing civil rights legislation with men like Mississippi Democrat James Eastland, who committed most of his life to defending white supremacy, he would simply call it the N bill. You see, the civil rights bill that a lot of us have applauded over the years from LBJ, he referred to it as the N-word bill. LBJ didn't pass this because he wanted to help Black people or because he liked Black people or he felt that Black people had been wrong. LBJ did this to trap Black people in the Democratic Party and to keep them there. And Black American voters have been there for quite some time since. It goes on to say, in 1957, Johnson would help get the N bill passed, known to most as the Civil Rights Act of 1957. With the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the segregationists would go to their graves knowing the cause they'd given their lives to had been betrayed, Frank Underwood style, by a man they believed to be one of their own. When Caro, asked segregationist Georgia Democrat Herman Talmadge how he felt when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. He said, "We shall overcome." Talmadge said, "Sick." The Civil Rights Act made it possible for Johnson to smash Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act made the U.S. government accountable to its Black citizens and a true democracy for the first time. Johnson lifted racist immigration restrictions designed to preserve a white majority and, by extension, white supremacy. He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, then more concerned with communists and civil rights activists, to turn his attention to crushing the KKK. Through the Fair Housing Act, never fulfilled its promise to end racial segregation. It was another massive effort to live up to the ideals American founders only half-heartedly believed in, a record surpassed by Abraham Lincoln. Now listen to this. As Johnson is celebrated by no less than 4 living presidents, to dismiss Johnson's racism was mere code switching, a clever ploy from uncompromising racial egalitarian whose idealism was matched only by his political ruthlessness. Johnson was a man of his time and bore those flaws as surely as he sought to lead the country past them. For 2 decades in Congress, he was a reliable member of the Southern Bloc, helping to stonewall civil rights legislation. This is the part, again, the Democratic Party doesn't like to discuss. He was a big part of that. Remember, LBJ was a senator. He was in the House of Representatives. He was in the military before he was president of the United States, and he actively worked to block those pieces of legislation. Listen to this part. As Carl recalls, Johnson spent the late 1940s railing against the hordes of barbaric yellow dwarves in East Asia. Beyond buying into the stereotype that Blacks were afraid of snakes, he'd drive to gas stations with one in his trunk and try to trick Black attendants into opening it. Once, Carl writes, the stunt nearly ended with him being bitten with a tire iron. This was LBJ who did this. This is who Democrats applaud. Nor was it the kind of immature flat boy racism that Johnson eventually jettisoned. Even as president, Johnson's interpersonal relationships with Blacks were marred by his prejudice. As longtime Jet correspondent Simon Booker wrote in his memoir, Shocks the Conscience, early in his presidency, Johnson once lectured Booker after he authored a critical article for Jet magazine, telling Booker he should thank Johnson for all he'd done for Black people. In Flawed Giant, Johnson biographer Robert Dallek writes that Johnson explained his decision to nominate Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court rather than a less famous Black judge by saying, "When I appoint an N-word to the bench, I want everyone to know he's an N-word." This was from LBJ. Don't tell me there's no racism in the Democratic Party. Another part here. According to Caro, Robert Parker, Johnson's sometime chauffeur, described in his memoir Capitol Hill in Black and White a moment when Johnson asked Parker whether he preferred to be referred to by his name rather than boy, N-word, or chief. When Parker said he would, Johnson grew angry and said, "As long as you're Black, and you're gonna be Black to the day you die, no one's gonna call you by your goddamn name. So no matter what you are called, N-word, you just let it roll off your back like water and you'll make it. Just pretend you're a goddamn piece of furniture." This is how LBJ felt about Black Americans. Now, if I didn't tell you who that came from, many people, if I read those quotes, they probably would just assume, oh, that must have been some Republican. No, that was a Democrat. A Democrat who JFK made his vice president. Now I want you to ask yourself this question. LBJ wasn't secretive about his racism. JFK, who believed in MLK's vision, why would JFK choose someone like that to be his VP? Well, for the same reason that Barack Obama chose someone like Joe Biden to be his, to get those who were white moderates to come along and vote for their package. Because you see, even within the Democratic Party, they're still willing to play along with racism to get the win. Now, something else that I thought was pretty interesting that we'll also have to get into. LBJ, by implementing the social programs, which I agree with Medicare, Medicaid, I agree with those things, but that was small compared to what should have been done. Because even when it comes to Medicare, don't forget there's a co-insurance portion. There's a 20%. Don't forget that what should have been done was healthcare for everyone, not these programs where you have to get to be a certain age to benefit from it. So when we talk about Medicare, obviously you have to be a certain age before you even qualify for Medicare. Now, if you're a strategist and you're a racist, but you're still trying to get the vote, well, then since you don't have universal health care, you're probably thinking that many of the Black people probably won't even live that long to get Medicare. These are things to think about, folks. So LBJ was able to capture the Black vote by implementing those social programs, and thus by passing that Civil Rights Act. And to his words, as he said, this will keep them voting Democrat for the next 60 years. But that wasn't what was owed. By doing so, he not only was able to crush the Black grassroots, what you also have to understand is that I believe this was one of the first steps of crushing the civil rights movement and Black liberation. Pulling Black people into the Democratic Party, pulling them off the streets of the protests. And then, of course, after that, killing their leaders. MLK, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, etc. The list goes on. It was to crush the grassroots. It was to crush the Black grassroots from demanding what was actually owed. And what was owed? I want you to see what happened to Seneca Village. I want you to see what you look at today as Central Park. I want you to see what the United States government, what the U.S. did to Black people that lived in Seneca Village. Check this out. Everybody needs to know about this.
They faced there. The village was founded in 1825 when landowners in the area, John and Elizabeth Whitehead, subdivided their land and sold it as 200 lots. Andrew Williams, a 25-year-old African-American shoe shiner, bought the first 3 lots for $125. Also, Epiphany Davis, a store clerk, bought 12 lots for $578 US, and the AME Zion Church purchased another 6 lots. From there, a community was born. From 1825 to 1832, the Whiteheads sold about half of their land parcels to other African Americans, and by the early 1830s, there were no less than 10 homes in the village. There is a couple pieces of evidence that shows that residents had gardens and raised livestock in Seneca Village.
Do you guys see how Black Americans, you see what happened? Do you see how Black Americans were building a community in Seneca Village, were building homes? All of this? Let's see what happened. Again, this is in the 1800s.
And the nearby Hudson River was a likely source of fishing for the community. A nearby spring, known as Tanner's Spring, provided a water source. By the mid-1850s, Seneca Village comprised 50 homes and 3 churches, as well as burial grounds, and a school for African American students. For African Americans, Seneca Village offered the opportunity to live in an autonomous community.
So Seneca Village was, working class neighborhood where black people in the 1800s, again, this course, this is after, slavery, they went there and they built like their own community. They had their own schools, their own homes, etc., all of that jazz, right? Everybody talks about Black Wall Street, Tulsa, and there were multiple Black Wall Streets, not just Tulsa, Oklahoma. Everybody talks about that, but a lot of people don't know about Seneca Village. These things didn't just happen down south. Every time Black people moved after post-slavery, every time and tried to build their own, it was either stolen or burned to the ground. Wait till you see what happens here.
Far from the densely populated downtown. Despite New York State's abolition of slavery in 1827, discrimination was still prevalent throughout New York City and severely limited the lives of African Americans. Seneca Village's remote location likely provided a refuge from this climate. It also provided an escape from the unhealthy and crowded conditions of the city and access to more space both inside and outside the home. Compared to other African Americans living in New York, residents of Seneca Village seem to have been more stable and prosperous. By 1855, approximately half of them owned their own homes. With property ownership came other rights not commonly held by African Americans in the city.
Pause right here. Most of them owned their own homes. So as you can see, Black people were starting to build generational wealth, right? Like home ownership, that's building generational wealth. But our government and the supremacy in this country didn't want that to happen. Didn't want that to happen. This is why whenever you hear people say, oh, Black people are lazy, they don't want to work, they never tried to build anything, that is a blatant lie. Now, what you need to ask yourself is, as much as we've learned in our history classes in school, and we're taught about slavery and we're taught about the civil rights movement, why isn't this in the textbooks? Why doesn't the textbooks include information about Seneca Village or the Black Wall Streets, which more people talk about Black Wall Street today, but that is a little bit more recent. Why isn't that information in the history books? Why don't they want you to know how Black Americans were able to build their own communities, started to establish some type of wealth, and it was burned down or it was stolen and they had to keep moving every time? Why isn't that in the history books? They don't want you to know about it.
Namely, the right to vote. The fact that many residents were property owners contradicts some common misperceptions during the mid-19th century that the people living on the land slated for the park were poor squatters living in shanties. While a few residents lived in shanties and in crowded conditions, most lived in two-story homes. Census records show that residents were employed, with African Americans typically employed as laborers and in service jobs, the main options for them at the time. Records also show that most children who lived in Seneca Village attended school. By the early 1850s, the city began planning for a large municipal park to counter unhealthful urban conditions and provide space for recreation. In 1853, the New York State Legislature enacted a law that set aside 775 acres of land in Manhattan.
This will be what you now know as Central Park. So do you guys see how Black people see how they saw Black people were building something and building wealth, and they said, oh, let's do a planned park. Let's have green space. This still happens today. It's called gentrification. When you see city planners go into urban neighborhoods and say, let's establish some green space, let's make it more walkable and more friendly, that means they ready to kick your ass out. And they sell it with green space. This is what they did. This New York has a debt that is owed to Black people, to Black Americans, to descendants of slavery. That is owed. These people lost all of their wealth in Seneca Village. They lost it. Gone. Displacement. Does that sound familiar? How many times have we talked about this? This happens all over the world, where people are just displaced, moved after they've built something.
From the 59th to the 106th Streets, between 5th and 8th Avenues, to create the country's first major landscape public park. The city acquired the land through eminent domain, the law that allows the government to take private land for public use with some compensation paid to the landowner. This was a common practice in the 19th century and had been used to build Manhattan's grid of streets decades earlier. There were roughly 1,600 inhabitants displaced throughout the area. Although landowners were compensated, many argued that their land was undervalued. Ultimately, all residents had to leave by the end of 1857.
All residents had to leave by the end of 1857. And notice what he said about the compensation. It was undervalued. Does that sound familiar? That still happens today. When Black people try to sell a home and they try to get it appraised, the appraisal was always lower if you're a Black family versus if you're a white family. This country has continued to find ways to keep Black people at the bottom. So when I say there are systemic issues, this is one of the things that I'm talking about. This is not about people being lazy. This is not about people getting a handout. And LBJ's response and Democrats' response to what was done to Black Americans in this country is to let's give everybody some Medicaid and some Medicare and all this types of stuff. Okay, I get it. But that went to everyone. And then there were certain requirements that you had to even meet to even get that. Giving people Medicare and Medicaid didn't stop the government from redlining communities, didn't stop the banks from turning you down, from getting a loan to get a home to establish generational wealth. That happened to my people. This is why this class only, let's just focus on class. Fuck that. Because Medicare and Medicaid, this response, this social package that LBJ had was a response to class. And Black people stayed at the bottom. Every time we were displaced. You see how Israel displaces Palestinian people. You see how they have pushed them out and keep pushing them. These things happen here, right here. But they don't want you to talk about it. Don't talk about history. Don't talk about that part of history. That's divisive. LBJ's response was weak, considering what was old, when you look at what was stolen, what was taken. And the Democratic Party has been giving Black people crumbs since then. And so when I say that you should leave the Democratic Party and you should register as an independent, this is part of the reason why I say it. You don't owe them anything. And the liberal simps will continue to say, she's secretly Republican, or she's trying to drive you into the Republican Party. I'm not driving you into any of these two parties. I'm getting you to walk away from the one that has abused and used you and is only giving you crumbs in return, instead of giving you what is owed. That is my response. LBJ was able to crush the Black grassroots. No more civil rights movement. No more demanding what we were owed. MLK was about to ask for reparations, not just equality. And everybody just went into the Democratic Party, and that was the end of that. Killed MLK. Killed Malcolm X. You guys know they killed Fred Hampton. Get the revolutionary leaders out the way. Give them some crumbs. Put them in the Democratic Party. Get them off the street. Stop them from protesting. And that's that. They won't ask for anything else. You even see it right now with whack ass Ro Khanna. Look at this. I can't believe he even said this shit. The Democratic Party must keep South Carolina as an early primary state. Charleston trafficked 40% of all enslaved Africans. Removing South Carolina is a betrayal of Black history and dumb politics in building a majority coalition to win. So Ro Khanna believes that the betrayal to Black history is removing South Carolina as an early primary state. And my response to Ro Khanna is no, Ro Khanna. Not implementing reparations is a betrayal of Black history. Making South Carolina the first primary state as a response to slavery is virtue signaling instead of implementing a debt that is owed. Does everybody see the pattern? You see how Ro Khanna and all of them just continuing on what LBJ did? No. Keep South Carolina as an early primary state, because that's disrespect to enslaved Africans, the country. Instead of giving us what's owed. By the way, Ro Khanna is very well versed on this, because when he came onto the show, when I interviewed him a couple years ago, I made it very clear to him that reparations is a debt that's owed and should be done. He's very aware of this. But here you even got people like him trying to sell you these crumbs. Just take an early primary state instead of us giving what's owed to you. This is how LBJ was able to trap Black Americans in the Democratic Party. And I honestly believe if these things didn't happen, let's say he wasn't able to do that, I really do believe that maybe we would have gotten further. I believe that as Black people, we would have come together and said, no, we're going to be independents. We're not going to make ourselves be a part of said party that hasn't done anything for us. So all these Black Americans ended up voting for, which races do I vote for today? Goldwater or LBJ? And in 2024, people were still like, which one do I vote for? We got to pick the lesser of two evils. And nothing has been done. The debt that is owed to Black Americans has not happened. That is a problem. And I continue to speak on that. And there are reparations that have been paid out to Japanese Americans who were the internments at the internment camps and their descendants, by the way. And it was cash reparations. And you never hear a lot of these people who talk about it as being divisive. I don't hear them say anything about that. So my demand to Black Americans who are watching this, leave the Democratic Party, register as an independent. And if people want your vote, they're going to have to do things for the Black community. There is no, I promise to do this after you vote for me. Nah, the thing should have been done prior. That's the fight that I am leading. And I sincerely hope you will be on that journey with me. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.